Japan, September 1945. The war was over, but the air still smelled of smoke and surrender. American tents dotted the ruined edge of Yokohama's harbor, torn canvas. Oil drums, rifles stacked like forgotten bones. Morning fog rolled in from the bay, wrapping the scene in silence broken only by the faint rattle of tin cups. A group of U.S. soldiers huddled around a small stove, heating dark liquid in dented metal pots. The scent rose. Sharp, rich, unmistakably American. Coffee. A few yards away, Japanese prisoners of war watched, their faces hollow from months of defeat and hunger. One muttered something under his breath. Another laughed softly, shaking his head. To them it was strange, this obsession the Americans had with a bitter drink. Then one of them accepted a cup. Steam curled through the air. He sipped. His expression changed, and the bitterness melted into warmth. Others followed. One by one, the men who once fought to the death now waited quietly. For a second cup. It wasn't just coffee. It was the first taste of peace. Before that morning on the Yokohama docks, before the laughter in the second cups, coffee had already fought its own quiet war. When Japan entered World War II in 1941, coffee was a symbol of the West, exotic, indulgent, and unnecessary. The Japanese Empire ran on rice, fish, and tea. Green tea wasn't just a drink, and it was heritage, purity, and discipline came steeped in it. To the Japanese mind, tea represented balance. Coffee, chaos. In Tokyo cafes of the 1930s, Western-leaning intellectuals once sipped the imported brew, imagining modernity through each bitter drop. But once the empire turned toward total war, imports vanished. Coffee beans were declared a non-essential luxury. Shipments from Java and Sumatra were diverted to the military. Civilians substituted roasted barley, soybeans, or acorns, anything that could mimic the scent, though never the taste. For most Japanese, coffee became a ghost of the West, a forgotten flavor of a world at peace. Across the Pacific, it was the opposite story. The United States Army practically marched on coffee. From the trenches of France in 1918 to the jungles of Guadalcanal, caffeine had become a ritual of survival. It wasn't luxury, and it was fuel. Each GI carried powdered packets or small tins inside field rations, marked simply coffee instant. When exhaustion blurred vision, when malaria and rain soaked through every uniform, soldiers didn't ask for water. They asked for heat, sugar, and coffee. The military knew this. By 1942, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps had standardized coffee rations for every serviceman, about 20 pounds per year per soldier. Factories in New Jersey and Chicago worked day and night to churn out instant coffee powder by the ton. The brand Nescafé, barely a decade old, became as essential as bullets. On transport ships bound for the Pacific, the scent of brewing coffee mixed with diesel fuel and salt air. The aroma of war and home blended into one. In the Pacific Theater, the contrast between armies was stark. Japanese soldiers trained to endure hunger and deprivation often marched without food for days. Tea was rare in the jungle. Clean water even rarer. Coffee didn't exist in their rations. Their discipline came not from comfort, but from denial, from the belief that hardship purified the spirit. To American troops, comfort was part of endurance. Between air raids and amphibious assaults, they built tiny worlds of familiarity. Heating water in helmets, brewing coffee over makeshift stoves, sharing sips before dawn. It was more than caffeine. It was civilization in a tin cup. Propaganda on both sides amplified the contrast. Japanese leaflets mocked soft Americans who needed coffee to wake up. U.S. pamphlets portrayed the Japanese as mechanical, joyless, alien to pleasure. Neither side understood how much truth and irony Those caricatures held. But as the war dragged on, even Japanese officers stationed in Southeast Asia began to rediscover the drink. In Java and Malaya, they seized Dutch plantations, exporting beans for profit and consumption among elites. Coffee returned. Quietly, selectively, reserved for high command. The same officers who scoffed at Western indulgence began to sip it in secret meetings, appreciating its strength, its alertness. The divide between doctrine and desire was growing, even as the empire began to crumble. By 1944, Japan's supply lines were collapsing. Allied submarines choked the seas. The home islands faced famine. Coffee was a distant dream. American bombers were coming. Every night Tokyo's sky glowed red, and across those same skies, inside B-29 bombers, American airmen drank coffee from thermos flasks. Steady hands, steady nerves, 30,000 feet above burning cities. The contrast could not have been sharper. One side starving, the other caffeinated. Yet both were human, driven by fatigue, hunger, and faith in their own endurance. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, it wasn't just an empire collapsing. It was an entire culture bracing for contact, a reckoning between two civilizations that had never truly understood each other. And in the months that followed, one of the first points of contact wouldn't be through weapons or politics, but through something far simpler. The aroma of American coffee drifting through a broken Tokyo morning. The surrender changed everything, not just for nations, but for taste. In the first weeks of the Allied occupation, Japan was a landscape of silence. Cities lay in ruins, railways twisted like burnt wires, and millions were displaced. The country's daily rhythm, work, tea, ritual, had collapsed. Rations were thin, water was rationed, and the black market ruled. Hunger replaced pride, then came the Americans. Convoys of trucks rolled through the rubble of Yokohama, Osaka, and Tokyo, carrying canned meat, flour, cigarettes, and coffee. Every U.S. base became a small fragment of home. Canteens glowed at night with laughter and jazz, filled with the scent of roasted beans. For Japanese civilians watching from outside the wire, it was more than curiosity. It was bewilderment. The occupiers drank something that symbolized comfort itself. Soldiers stood casually, cups in hand, while locals queued for rice. The thin, bitter aroma spread into neighborhoods, drifting through the ruins. It wasn't long before curiosity won over resentment. Reports from the time described Japanese laborers and interpreters on U.S. bases being offered cups of coffee. At first they smiled politely, expecting sweetness. But coffee wasn't sweet. It was sharp, smoky, foreign. Faces twisted, laughs escaped. America no kusai nomimono. The smelly American drink. The soldiers chuckled in return. Then came the sugar, the milk. And with that, something changed. The bitterness gave way to warmth. For many, it was the first warm liquid they'd tasted in days that wasn't broth or rationed soup. And beneath that warmth, something else. A strange familiarity. Energy. Alertness. Even pleasure. For the Americans, it was second nature. For the Japanese, it was revelation. Within months, coffee tins and instant packets began circulating through the black market. Items stamped with U.S. Army property sold quietly behind bombed-out shops. Housewives learned to dissolve brown crystals into hot water. For some, it was medicine. For others, a small taste of victory disguised as curiosity. In Tokyo's surviving kisaten, traditional cafes, old owners began reopening their doors. They used whatever beans they could scavenge from military supplies. Occupation Authority, SCAP, encouraged the import of food and goods that could stabilize civilian morale. Among them, coffee. American companies saw opportunity. Nestle, Hills Brothers, and Folgers all eyed Japan's new consumer market, though scarcity made official trade slow. But the idea had taken root. Coffee was modern, democratic, alive. For Japan's younger generation, raised under wartime austerity, coffee became something more. Rebellion. Tea was ceremony. Coffee was change. Students in post-war Tokyo sipped it as they read American novels, listened to jazz, or discussed democracy. Every cafe that reopened became a small island of freedom amid ruins. And it all began from those early moments. POW camps, work crews, surrender meetings, where Americans shared coffee not as propaganda, but as habit. A habit that crossed the boundary between conqueror and conquered. There were still deep scars. For every moment of shared warmth there were thousands of unspoken wounds. Families lost, cities erased, pride shattered. But even then, tiny acts of humanity slipped through the cracks of occupation life. A GI offering a steaming cup to a silent farmer, a Japanese nurse learning to mix coffee for American patients, a captured soldier laughing at its bitterness, then asking for more. Coffee wasn't peace, but it was the first taste of something that felt like it. Over the next few years, that taste would grow from an exotic curiosity into a national obsession, transforming from a symbol of defeat into one of reinvention. Because Japan wouldn't just adopt American coffee, it would master it, and, in time, make it its own. Every war strips away comfort, but in the mud, rain and noise, soldiers find small rituals that remind them they're still human. For the Americans, that ritual was coffee. From Normandy to the Solomon Islands, it was the same. Men crouched around blackened mess tins, lighting fires under helmets or ammo cans, waiting for water to boil. It wasn't gourmet. It was survival with flavor. One sip, and the fog in the mind lifted. In the Pacific, where humidity rotted everything and exhaustion was constant, that simple ritual meant hope. Soldiers said they could tell time by the smell. Morning coffee before the first patrol, evening coffee before the next watch. It was connection, to home, to each other, to life before the war. For Japanese soldiers, survival meant the opposite: denial, discipline, and silence. In the jungles of New Guinea or the caves of Okinawa, there were no such luxuries. They carried dry rice, sometimes pickled plums. A warm drink was a dream. Coffee wasn't even in their language of war. So when captured soldiers first tasted it after the surrender, it wasn't just the caffeine that startled them. It was the memory of warmth, a feeling they'd been trained to suppress. That first sip was more than flavor. It was a reminder that being human could still feel good. The U.S. Army had studied fatigue like an enemy. By 1943, field manuals explicitly listed coffee as a morale and alertness tool. Sleep was scarce. Patrols rotated through night shifts. Pilots flew for 12 hours, and ground troops sometimes fought 3 days without rest. Caffeine in precise doses became strategy. The Quartermaster Corps designed compact rations, Type C and Type K, each including packets of instant coffee, sugar, and powdered cream. Soldiers joked that the Army ran on octane and caffeine, but it wasn't far from truth. Commanders noticed the effects. Men stayed sharp longer, reacted faster, and recovered quicker from exhaustion. Coffee wasn't just morale, it was tactical endurance. Even the Navy ran caffeine drills aboard ships, coffee on watch, coffee before battle stations, coffee before dawn bombardments. In Japanese doctrine, the word gamen, endurance through suffering, satan, replaced stimulants. A soldier's worth was measured by how much deprivation he could withstand. They marched through hunger, heat, and disease without aid. Many officers viewed comfort as weakness. The Americans viewed comfort as efficiency. That difference in between suppression and stimulation shaped the psychology of the war itself. One side fought to endure. The other fought to sustain. By war's end, the American military had proven that morale wasn't born from stoicism. It was manufactured, brewed and served in tin cups for centuries. Japan's soul had steeped in tea. The chanoyu, or tea ceremony, wasn't just a drink. It was art, meditation, and social code. Every motion carried meaning, humility, patience, grace. Tea reflected balance between the self and nature. Coffee, by contrast, was industrial, the product of speed, steel, and commerce. It was loud, urban, and Western. To pre-war Japan, coffee represented modernity's chaos, the very thing the empire claimed to resist. But after the war, that distinction blurred. The occupation brought exposure not just to Western power, but to Western rhythm, efficiency, energy, consumption. In that new order, coffee fit perfectly. American soldiers didn't brew coffee in silence. They gulped it between jokes, between rebuilding projects, between meals. It was democratic. No ritual, no rank. Anyone could pour it. Anyone could drink it. Japanese civilians watching this saw something deeper than caffeine. They saw equality. Tea had always been about hierarchy. Host and guest, master and disciple. Coffee, in contrast, flattened the room. It was simple, quick, alive. And so, in post-war Tokyo, coffee houses began to shift their mood. The old Kissaton that once hosted quiet poetry readings now buzzed with jazz, laughter, and talk of democracy. Coffee became a symbol of self-expression, the new Japan rising from rubble, breaking its silence one cup at a time. By the early 1950s, Kohi was no longer a foreign word. It was a promise that Japan could modernize without losing its soul, and that even bitterness, if brewed right, could taste like renewal. In war, morale is invisible until it disappears. The U.S. Army learned this early. A soldier's state of mind was as critical as his ammunition. Letters from home, cigarettes, and coffee formed the trinity of comfort. Psychologists embedded with combat units during the Second World War noted that caffeine's effect extended far beyond energy. It created rhythm, a moment of pause between chaos. Brewing coffee meant a break, a conversation, a shared ritual that re-centered men amid uncertainty. To Japanese eyes, this was puzzling. They were taught that emotion was indulgence. The Imperial Army expected silence, endurance, and loyalty unto death. The result was a force of immense discipline and profound psychological fragility. Soldiers often broke only when isolation became unbearable. Coffee, simple as it was, served as social glue for the Americans. One pot brought a dozen men together. A bad day could be softened by a strong brew. Even in prisoner camps, Americans bartered for grounds, boiling them 3 times over. When Japanese prisoners finally experienced this ritual, they understood something their officers had not. Morale wasn't luxury. It was sustenance, brewed 1 cup at a time. Behind every cup that steamed on a jungle rock or in a bomber cockpit was a massive invisible machine, the U.S. Army's coffee system was a logistical triumph, part chemistry, part industry, part morale engineering. By 1943, American companies such as Nestlé and G. Washington Coffee had converted peacetime factories into caffeine engines. Powdered coffee could survive tropical humidity, dissolve instantly, and ship in crates marked rations beverage type. Cargo ships carried tons of it. Sometimes they were tins of coffee and cigarettes to steady the troops. Japanese logistics were the inverse. Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin across the Pacific, and coffee beans, once imported from colonial holdings in Southeast Asia, were now seized or destroyed. The empire fed its men on rice and hope. That imbalance, caffeine versus hunger, reflected deeper truths about industrial warfare. America's power lay not only in factories and fleets but in its ability to sustain comfort under fire. Japan's soldiers were fierce, but their empire starved itself into collapse. And yet, when peace returned, those same supply routes, rebuilt and redirected, carried something new: coffee shipments to Japan. Within a decade, U.S. corporations and Japanese entrepreneurs together flooded Tokyo's docks with beans from Brazil and Hawaii. The very machinery that once fueled war now supplied culture. Every war story, no matter how brutal, eventually narrows to a single human moment, one that quietly rewrites everything that came before. For many who lived through the Pacific War, that moment arrived in a cup of coffee. There are accounts from occupation diaries. A Japanese interpreter describing the first time an American officer handed him a steaming mug. A nurse in Hiroshima Hospital writing how American medical staff shared their rations with patients. A former soldier confessing that he hated the smell at first, until it reminded him that enemies, too, could be kind. Coffee became a quiet bridge between conqueror and conquered. Its bitterness mirrored the years that preceded it. Years of propaganda, loss and pride, yet its warmth offered something unfamiliar: equality. Both sides sipped it, both found comfort in it, and for the first time, they looked at one another not through sights of rifles but through steam rising from tin cups. History rarely remembers these small mercies, but they are the foundation of peace, the proof that humanity survives even in ashes. The laughter that followed that first bitter sip in 1945 wasn't mockery anymore. It was relief, a shared recognition that even bitterness could bring warmth when shared. Okinawa, June 1945. The war was nearly over, though no one dared to say it aloud. On the beaches, shattered helmets and canteens glittered in the sunlight. Thousands of prisoners waited behind barbed wire, their faces hollow, their uniforms in rags. They had fought to the last bullet, then finally to the last breath. Among the rows of tents, American medics moved carefully, handing out food and water. The Japanese prisoners were wary. They had been told Americans tortured captives that they were monsters without honor. Instead, they saw young men barely older than themselves offering not blows but cups. From one tent drifted a smell none of the prisoners recognized. Burnt, earthy, strange. Inside, a small pot hissed over a gasoline stove. A U.S. corporal poured dark liquid into metal cups, mixing it with sugar and milk powder. He motioned toward a prisoner, hesitant, gaunt, trembling. The man sniffed the cup suspiciously, muttered something about Western poison. Then he sipped. His face twisted, eyes squeezed shut, bitter, acrid, and then softened. He swallowed again. Another sip. He nodded, almost smiling. The corporal grinned and handed another cup down the line. The next man hesitated less. Soon quiet laughter broke the tension. Small human sounds amid the ruins. Prisoners began to line up not for rations, but for this foreign drink. For a few minutes there were no victors, no defeated, only tired men sharing warmth in a place that had known nothing but fire. That scene repeated across the Pacific as surrender spread. On Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima, captured Japanese soldiers discovered American coffee. For the GIs it was habit. For the Japanese, revelation. Something so simple, a hot, bitter drink, became a symbol of humanity's strange resilience. When news of Japan's surrender reached the camps, those who survived described the taste of that last cup of coffee as the moment they realized the war had truly ended. Not because a document had been signed, but because an enemy had offered them something that tasted alive. Weeks later, in Yokohama and Tokyo, the same exchange unfolded on a larger scale. Allied occupation forces distributed food and rations, including coffee, to Japanese workers assisting in reconstruction. At first few touched it. The memory of propaganda was still fresh. Coffee was decadent, Western, a mark of corruption. But scarcity has its own diplomacy. The first civilians to drink it were dock workers and interpreters. Then nurses, police, teachers. By 1946, it was appearing in public cafeterias. The same nation that once banned the bean now sipped it in the ruins of its cities. Newspapers recorded the shift. An article in the Yomiuri Shimbun from late 1946 described the strange popularity of America no Nomimono, noting with irony how quickly it spread despite its bitterness. Even our elders, the piece read, have learned to enjoy this drink that once smelled like defeat. For American troops, it was a comfort that never lost meaning. For the Japanese, it was both humiliation and curiosity, a reminder that strength now wore a different face. But something deeper was happening beneath the surface. In the warmth of those cups, the bitterness began to fade. People who had seen death on both sides of the Pacific found in that strange drink a shared simplicity. Heat, energy, life. Coffee did not erase loss or guilt, but it offered a small daily truce. Every cup poured on a street corner in a base kitchen or at a factory break table carried a whisper that enemies could meet again as people. By the time 1945 turned to 1946, Japan was beginning to change, its factories producing goods not for war but for trade. Its citizens learning words once forbidden, democracy, jazz, freedom, and in every American base the smell of coffee drifted beyond the fences, mingling with the wind of a new era. The laughter that once mocked it had turned to something else. Acceptance, even fondness. Coffee had survived the fire, and in doing so, it had quietly brewed a connection between two worlds that had tried to destroy each other. Soon, that connection would leave the camps and enter the cities, reshaping Japanese streets, culture, and commerce. The transformation was no longer about survival, it was about rebirth. Tokyo, 1946. The city that once ruled an empire now stood in ashes, charred beams, broken windows, streets lined with the ghosts of houses that no longer existed. Yet amid the rubble something unexpected began to stir, the smell of coffee. At first it drifted from U.S. occupation canteens and Red Cross kitchens. American soldiers brewed it daily, a comfort of home amid the wreckage. Japanese civilians working nearby noticed. They watched the casual routine, the laughter, the tin mugs, the steady rhythm of pouring and stirring. It was unlike anything from the old Japan. Soon the aroma spread beyond military fences. Former Kisaten, Japan's pre-war coffee houses, began reopening in bombed-out neighborhoods. Some used salvaged furniture, cracked porcelain, and rusty kettles. They had no imported beans, so they roasted barley, corn, or soybeans, trying to mimic the American flavor. Even the faintest imitation of real coffee drew crowds. People came not for taste, but for the memory of peace, for the chance to feel normal again. Then, in 1947, the real beans returned. The U.S. Occupation Administration approved small-scale imports of Brazilian coffee through relief programs. It was a gesture of normalization, to provide civilians with familiar comforts and to stimulate local economies. For Japan, it marked the return of a world beyond scarcity. Young entrepreneurs saw the opportunity. One of them, Tadao Washima, would later found UCC Coffee, a company that would redefine Japan's relationship with the drink. But in those early days it was small merchants who kept the flame alive. They roasted beans in iron pans, sold cups from street carts, and filled the empty city with scent and smoke. Inside the cafes, something remarkable happened. People talked about the war, about loss, about America and the future. In a country stripped of pride and propaganda, conversation itself was liberation. The cafes became sanctuaries for artists, students, and thinkers, places where new ideas brewed alongside coffee. The traditional tea room had always been about harmony and silence. The post-war cafe was about curiosity and noise. It pulsed with jazz music brought by GIs with laughter, with dreams of democracy and progress. Even occupation officers noticed. Reports from 1948 describe Tokyo's growing coffee culture as both a morale stabilizer and a cultural bridge. American soldiers and Japanese civilians often shared tables in these small spaces, an unthinkable act just years earlier. Coffee had become neutral ground, a space where conqueror and conquered could meet as people, not adversaries. By the early 1950s, imported coffee was no longer rare. Japan's reconstruction economy was accelerating, and coffee imports surged alongside steel and textiles. Nescafé and Maxwell House appeared in department stores. A cup of coffee was no longer an alien luxury. It was a sign of modern life. What began as mockery, laughter at the bitterness of a foreign drink, had turned into addiction, even affection. Cafes spread across Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. Newspapers ran advertisements showing businessmen holding white porcelain cups under the slogan, "Start your day the American way." Housewives learned to mix instant coffee for guests. The bitterness that once symbolized defeat had become the flavor of recovery. Meanwhile, American troops leaving Japan took back stories of this new phenomenon, how a nation once defined by tea had embraced their own ritual. It fascinated them, even humbled them. There was irony in it. The same beverage that had fueled soldiers through destruction now powered the rebuilding of what they destroyed. But that was history's quiet way of balancing itself. The streets that once echoed with air raid sirens now hummed with conversation and clinking cups. The bitterness of war had transformed into a shared daily comfort, one spoon of sugar at a time. By 1952, when the Allied occupation officially ended, coffee had already rooted itself in the Japanese identity. It no longer belonged to the Americans. It belonged to Japan, refined, reimagined, and deeply personal. In the ruins of defeat, coffee had become a symbol of something larger, the nation's ability to take bitterness and brew it into strength. The laughter had long since faded. In its place came quiet gratitude, and the beginning of Japan's post-war rebirth. By the early 1950s, Japan was awakening not only from the trauma of war, but into the rhythm of a new daily life, one driven by work, reconstruction, and caffeine. What began as a novelty in military camps was now a national habit. When the Allied occupation officially ended in 1952, the numbers told the story. Japan imported over 10,000 tons of coffee beans that year, a staggering figure for a nation that had banned the product only a decade earlier. By 1955, imports had doubled. The economic miracle was underway, and coffee was part of it. Factories that once produced ammunition now manufactured percolators, kettles, and enamel mugs. Merchants rebuilt shattered trade links with Brazil, Colombia, and Indonesia. Shipments of Santos and Blue Mountain beans arrived at Tokyo Bay, filling warehouses that had once stored weapons. Coffee had become a quiet barometer of Japan's recovery. In offices, it symbolized productivity. In homes, hospitality. In public, modernity. A cup of coffee said, "We've joined the modern world again." American influence remained visible. Nescafé ads appeared in Japanese newspapers as early as 1953, promising energy for the new day. But this time it wasn't occupation propaganda. It was commerce. Japan's middle class was emerging and it had money to spend, not on survival, but on small luxuries that made life feel civilized again. Among the earliest domestic brands to capitalize on this was UCC, Ueshima Coffee Company. Founded in Kobe in 1933 but reborn after the war, its founder, Tadao Ueshima, envisioned coffee not as an imported fad but as a Japanese craft. By 1958, UCC was blending domestic roasting precision with Western boldness, marketing coffee as both elegant and efficient, the ideal drink for a nation learning to balance tradition with progress. Other companies followed. Key Coffee, Kohiken, and Kisaten chains across Osaka and Tokyo, each giving the drink its own Japanese touch, refined brewing, porcelain cups, quiet atmosphere. Coffee houses evolved into places of reflection, conversation, and culture, much like tea rooms once were, but louder, more alive. The Japanese twist on coffee was meticulous. Beans were roasted lighter, water measured to the milliliter, brewing performed with ritual-like care. In this, the Japanese spirit of craftsmanship, monozukuri, found new expression. They hadn't just adopted coffee, they'd perfected it. Meanwhile, the U.S. military continued to influence taste indirectly. PX stores on bases stocked American brands, and Japanese suppliers learned packaging, marketing, and shelf life management from them. This exchange turned Japan into one of the most efficient coffee logistics networks in Asia, a transformation built, paradoxically, from the ruins of war. By the late 1950s, Japan had moved from importing beans to exporting culture. Magazines featured coffee fashion. Advertisements used English words to signal cosmopolitan sophistication. And university students met in smoky cafes to debate politics over siphon brewers. Coffee had become Japan's post-war symbol of thought, independence, and connection to the outside world. But beneath the economic success lay a quieter legacy. Every sip carried the memory of its beginning, of tired soldiers, ruined cities, and that first shared cup between enemies. The same bitterness that once marked defeat now fueled progress. By 1960, Tokyo alone had over 3,000 coffee houses, serving everyone from poets to salarymen. Japan, once a nation of tea and discipline, had become one of the most coffee-obsessed countries on earth, not through conquest or imitation, but through transformation. The aroma that once symbolized occupation now floated through train stations, universities, and homes, not foreign anymore, but familiar. And in that transformation, the story of post-war Japan, resilience, reinvention, and quiet strength could be tasted in every cup. By the 1960s, coffee was no longer an imported curiosity in Japan. It was a mirror reflecting how the nation had rebuilt itself. Each cafe that opened in the shadow of the occupation became a small act of cultural declaration. Japan would move forward, not as an imitator of the West, but as its equal. The Japanese took what had once been a symbol of foreign dominance and gave it discipline, precision, and beauty. Ceremony now elevated the brewing of coffee to the same quiet art. In Tokyo's Ginza district, narrow kisaten glowed through the fog of cigarette smoke and neon. Baristas, dressed not as waiters but as craftsmen, used glass siphons that resembled chemistry sets, timing every drip to perfection. The result was clarity in a cup, pure, aromatic, measured. It wasn't just taste, it was identity. To drink coffee in post-war Japan meant embracing the future, urban, global, confident. The young generation that filled these cafes they didn't bow before the bitterness. They savored it. Coffee became a quiet metaphor for the nation's transformation, from rigidity to reflection, from command to conversation. The emotional resonance ran deep. For the older generation, coffee carried ghosts. The smell of occupation, the echo of defeat, the reminder of change forced by circumstance. Yet even they began to find comfort in its routine. It reminded them of survival, of continuity. Each sip reaffirmed that Japan still endured. Meanwhile, abroad, the irony did not go unnoticed. American veterans visiting Japan in the 1950s were astonished to find thriving cafes serving stronger, more carefully brewed coffee than what they had back home. What had begun as a moment of pity, a gesture of humanity on a battlefield, had evolved into cultural exchange, then into mastery. The Japanese didn't just consume coffee, they studied it. Universities researched roasting temperatures and bean chemistry. Writers romanticized it. Musicians composed to it. The Kisseton became the nucleus of Japan's post-war creative movement. Poets, painters, and philosophers gathered under hanging bulbs, their notebooks stained with the smell of roast. By the 1970s, Japan had even industrialized its passion. In 1969, UCC introduced the world's first canned coffee, a portable version designed for commuters and factory workers. Convenient, modern, and distinctly Japanese. It was the final transformation of a foreign habit into a national invention. Within a decade, vending machines across the country dispensed both hot and cold coffee, available at every corner every hour. No longer a foreign flavor, coffee had become part of Japan's identity, efficient, refined, and emotionally complex. Its journey had mirrored Japan's own, born in resistance, tempered in defeat, reborn in discipline. There was also something poetic in how Japan embraced bitterness. The flavor that once mocked them now symbolized their endurance, proof that they could turn even the taste of loss into art. When Japanese businessmen later met their American counterparts over coffee in gleaming Tokyo offices, the dynamic had changed. The drink was no longer a symbol of submission, it was a symbol of parity. Two nations that had fought to annihilation now spoke through trade, culture, and caffeine. The same drink that soldiers once shared in silence had, over decades, become a medium of peace, and somewhere, perhaps in memory or metaphor, the laughter of those first prisoners on Okinawa still echoed, not in mockery but in wonder. They had tasted something strange and foreign, never knowing that their hesitant sips would one day become the flavor of Japan's rebirth. History often remembers the battles, not the breakfasts. It remembers the bombs, not the cups quietly passed between former enemies. But sometimes the truest stories of transformation are brewed slowly, in silence, in warmth, in the ordinary rituals that follow catastrophe. The story of coffee in Japan isn't about taste. It's about identity. It began with laughter, the kind born of disbelief, and ended with devotion. What was once a symbol of defeat became the aroma of recovery, in every cafe that rose from the rubble. In every can that hissed open on a train platform, there lived a memory that bitterness can be remade into comfort. For the Americans, coffee had always been fuel, the taste of motion, work, and speed. For the Japanese, it became reflection, the taste of discipline, precision, and calm. Two cultures once locked in total war met through the same simple act, heating water and waiting. And in that waiting, they rediscovered what war had tried to erase: patience, understanding, humanity. By the late 20th century, coffee had traveled full circle. Japan, once a defeated nation drinking from American rations, was now exporting its own brewing methods, machines, and philosophies across the world. From Kyoto siphons to Tokyo espresso bars, the student had become the master. A century after the Pacific War, the irony lingers that something as humble as coffee could bridge the deepest human divide. Yet maybe that's what survival really is, the quiet art of turning bitterness into strength. Because in the end, history is not only written in treaties and timelines, it's written in the small moments. The trembling hand of a prisoner accepting a cup from his enemy, the first cautious sip, the warmth spreading through cold fingers, and the realization that the war finally is over. A war that began with fire ended with steam, And in that rising steam, two nations saw not defeat or victory, but the same fragile reflection of peace.